Now, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. It's great to see. Great to have you all here in spite of the weather and the last-minute topic change. My name is Shanna Altrichter. As Ann said, I am a sociology faculty member here at UMR. This is my fourth year teaching.
I'm Rachel Olson. I'm also 4 years at UMR, and I'm in the biology faculty member.
One of the classes that we offer here at University of Minnesota Rochester in the spring is called Social Justice and Ethical Decision Making. And it is in that course that we have offered this talk before. I've invited Rachel into the class several times to take part in the overall module, which is about resource allocation. We try to engage students in conversation about resource allocation because with many aspects of life, needs are often very great, and the resources available in order to meet those needs are finite. Because those resources are finite, we have to make decisions about how we're going to use those resources. And that is especially true when we're talking about endangered species. And so the topic for tonight is, what are we going to save? Because there's an awful lot of species that are endangered or threatened that we need to save, but we may not necessarily have the resources available to save all of them.
So to begin, we have obviously a slide of images. I'm just going to list the animals off because after you get a little bit of, we're going to have you guys have to make a selection. We're going to force you to make a selection. So if we go at the top row, these are probably, at least to begin with, animals that you're very familiar with. The panda bear, top left, polar bear, rhino. This is a particular kind of mussel called a snuff box mussel. You can actually find it in the Midwest region. And then top right is a lichen. Now if we go to the bottom left row, we have a sugar maple. The middle kind of lime green picture there are stigma moths. And then to the right, yes, thank you, Jim, a mangrove. And then further to the right, that is actually a living critter. Does anyone readily recognize it? Critters. There's many of them. They are the type of worm that affects worms. Specifically, the common name is sewage worm. They're sewage worms. Okay, bottom left, we have a cute little groundhog. Next to it is an otter. Next to that is a greater sage grouse. Then we have the spotted owl. And this one, I like the name of it, is a dragon blood tree.
Right, so all of these species and many others are either threatened or endangered. And you may be familiar with other species that are threatened or endangered as well. So, our question for you, and we do very much value your input here, if you had to save one thing, you only have the resources to save one thing, what would it be?
Trees.
And why trees?
They turn carbon dioxide into oxygen.
Okay,
They make air.
they make air. Okay, anybody else?
Polar bear.
The polar bear. Why the polar bear?
Maybe stop the ice. If they survive the ice caps would melt.
Okay, maybe we save them, we'll save the ice caps. Any others? Are there any others not on this list that are near and dear to your heart that you would want to be saved? Yes.
Elephants.
The elephants? Why the elephants?
Big shot of their tusks.
Yeah.
See that stuff.
Okay, yeah. A really big concern for elephants is the poaching that's being done in order to take their tusks from them, which leaves them without the ability to defend themselves. So yeah, we have a lot of species that we want to save, and we have different criteria that we use to determine why we want to save them. These criteria are all important, but ecologically speaking, we have to figure out what's most important for the Earth. What criteria are we going to use for determining what we save overall? Right now, ecologists and conservationists are in agreement that we are at a point where we have so many endangered and threatened species and so few resources and with so little time that we cannot save them all. So we have to make a decision. Which species are we going to save? It is no longer possible to save them all. And the criteria we often use in order to determine which to save might not be the most scientifically based. So we have a quote there from Morgan Trimble, who's a conservation scientist at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And he says that there's been this long-standing debate about the conservation of charismatic species, such as gorillas and elephants, over others. These are species that mean a lot to us. They're often really cute. As you can see the picture of the baby elephant there. Elephants are adorable. We want to save them. Meerkats are another example of a species that we give a lot of money and attention to, both in what we study and in conservation dollars, because they're cute. They live in families, they support each other. We have shows on the Discovery Channel about their cute little, almost like apartment-like complexes that they build underneath the ground. They are amazing. And we want to save them. That means that they get a lot of conservation money. But ecologically speaking, is it important that we save the meerkats? Or is it important that we save the elephants? Is that what is going to be most beneficial to the earth? This is an important question, especially because there are many other species that don't get any attention. And generally speaking, the uglier something is, the less likely it is to get funding. So for example, on the left there we have the manatee, the West African manatee, also sometimes known as the sea cow. The sea cow probably wouldn't win any beauty contests. And it also doesn't win very many conservation dollars either. Even more serious is the fact that we very often do not donate money towards saving inanimate objects, or inanimate species, like the mangrove. The mangrove is a really important habitat for many other species, and it itself is threatened. But because it's a tree, that doesn't usually really tug at the heartstrings the way a panda does, or the way an elephant does. So very little attention is given to these species in favor of species that are much more charismatic. So many conservation scientists, such as Trimble, claim that our focus on the cute, on the furry, or the large, the megafauna, mean that we don't pay enough attention to the less cute, the ugly, or less compelling fauna that are very important ecologically, but don't necessarily tug on those heartstrings in the same way. As a counterpoint, I want to make it clear that not all conservationists agree with this point of view. Sally Wren, who is from the Zoological Society of London, says that it can be important to focus on these megafauna because quite often when people donate money, they don't necessarily donate to one specific animal. So maybe the elephants and the fact that they're dying off in large numbers motivates somebody to give money. But then the recipients of that money dole it out to those that need it the most. So that could happen. It is often these really cute heartstring pulling species that allow us to donate. The concern is that quite often donations do get earmarked. So for example, WWF, the World Wildlife Federation, has in the past allowed you to earmark where your money goes. So if you give, say, $20 and say, I specifically want this to go to save the pandas, or I specifically want this to go to save koala bears, that means that that money, because it's been earmarked, cannot ethically be used to save other species that may actually be more threatened.
Okay, so what determines the level of funding for an endangered species? We're going to be discussing a little bit about later on government acts that help protect us, but as Shannon just said, that the results suggest there's been a lot of research on this. We'll show some data from research that the animal size affects spending decisions, that the larger the animal, the more money that it will receive, and that animals designated as high priorities by the federal government do not receive significantly more funds than animals given lower priorities. Okay, the one thing we need to consider is that Shannon even also, we both have used the term species or fauna. Particularly in the last slide, both terms were used, fauna in the top paragraph and species, or two slides ago, species in the second paragraph. But how many species exist? Roughly 3 million species have been described. And when I say this, only 1.5 million in any kind of detail. By detail, I mean that there's more than like some kind of physical description. So you can name a species if you but maybe you don't go beyond to like a habitat or what it interacts with or what it's phylogenetically related to. You might not have a collection of it in a museum. So only 1.5 million have some more detail than a description, right? Some ecological knowledge about its practice behavior. Behavior is always good to know. And the estimates of the number of species present range about 9 million, or 5 to 100 million. I like the 9 million one. I have a very large academic crush on a man named Terry Irwin. He works for the Smithsonian Institute. He is an entomologist. He has done very exciting research. And one of my goals, I'm an entomologist by training. So my master's and my PhD are both in entomology. I love it. And what he did is he would travel and he would use an insecticide, particularly permethrin. And this was a long time ago, so I like, well, quite some time. But he would fog a tree, right? And he'd smoke a tree, a variety of trees, and then all the insects would drop. And then they would collect all the insects on these tarps and bring it back and count. And they would look at a variety of factors, including new species that have never been described, existing species, numbers, etc., and extrapolate out from that, right? So we're talking like huge guesstimates. But I really like him. I have met him a few times. He is one of the only individuals on the planet that when I get up next to, I can't say anything. Like, I become starstruck when I see him. But his numbers are where you actually see that 8.7 plus or minus 1.3.
In case you're wondering if her training as an entomologist means that she brings bugs to school, the answer is yes. Yes, she does.
Whenever possible. It's important to do so. Another thing to consider is that some species we just don't know a lot about. For example, there are some that live in locations that are difficult to get to. So cloud forests are one such location. Also, some people are just not interested in, or also the technology might not currently be available or readily usable to study things like bacterial species, and how you define what a species is a bacteria is another whole argument. But also parasites, so nematodes. There are nematodes that live in everything. So insects have nematodes, right? So nematodes are everywhere. And it's really hard, if you think of technology, right? It's really tiny. So how do you describe a nematode? And there's not a lot of money for nematodes. But
Apparently my description of teeny tiny wriggly thing is not sufficient.
No, not at all. Okay, but then there's another issue of, where's this other thing? Oh, when we transferred our slides from our normal PPT to the Google, it moved things around, but that's okay, we'll work with it. But there's an ethical issue to the species problem. So, are species real, first of all, is one thing. So we need to figure out what is the definition of a species. If you're going to protect something, you have to have an agreed upon definition of what you're going to protect, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. And one of the issues is, we as humans don't think all species are worth saving.
How many of you would eradicate mosquitoes if you could? Yeah, see? We don't like mosquitoes. They annoy us. But that doesn't mean that they're not important ecologically.
Not because they annoy us, but what about these diseases?
Oh yeah, they absolutely spread diseases.
Yeah.
But we can't discount the fact that, environmentally speaking, mosquitoes are pretty important, as Dr. Olson can attest to.
There are many, many, many species of mosquitoes. I don't remember the exact number off my head, but it's somewhere like 150 or so in the U.S., I think. I don't remember. But there's only very few mosquito species that we as humans actually interact with. All mosquitoes, females, need to bite or have blood meal in order to lay eggs. Males will never ever bite you. You can tell the difference. If a mosquito lands on you with a really pretty fuzzy antenna, it's accidentally on you. It will not bite you. If it has a thin antenna, it's a female, and she'll probably be biting you. But most all species cannot obtain a blood meal from humans, so they ignore you. So if we wipe out mosquitoes, that's a huge problem because there's so many species and they're really important for the food web. But again, we need to have a discussion of species problems. So what are species? There are a variety of species concepts. So last I looked, there are 52 defined species concepts. I'm sure we can come up with a few more. But there's 4 big ones that are frequently talked about. There's a biological, morphological, ecological, and phylogenetic. All of these things allow some classification of an organism.
Yeah, so when Dr. Olson says species concepts, what she's saying is there's 4 main ways that we use to categorize species, or essentially put different species together.
So the biological, actually if I ask you guys, what is a species? What is your definition of a species? What comes to your mind right away?
Well, they're very specific, because you go through the phylum. They're very,
Right, they're specific. So you're thinking of phylogenetic way, but how would you, what else defines a species?
Kind of something.
A kind of something. Yes, right, this is actually a really tough question. If you've never been asked it, you've probably never thought, you probably just assume, oh, I know what a species is, right? You go along your day and have this general knowledge of what a species is, but in reality, do you really know what a species is? There are, again, the 4. So biological, the main premise of this are organisms that can reproduce. So reproductive organisms. And typically, they are looking at reproductive organisms that share a population. So you might be looking at ducks in one area that might technically, depending on how you define species, be the same species as a duck in another country. In theory, they could reproduce, but in reality, they probably never will. Morphological, some people like to just group things based upon what they look like. This one is actually fairly useful if you're looking at fossil records. Biological, we can't necessarily tell. If you look at a fossil, if it can reproduce with that other fossil, right? We have no idea. But morphological, we can do that. Ecological, the concept of these organisms live in the same area. They feed upon similar things. They sleep around similar times. They're running from similar predators. So there's an ecological niche component. And then phylogenetic is the idea that you share common ancestors. So looking at like kind of like ancestry.com for other organisms. So let's look at these and our species concepts. I don't know where to begin. Let's begin at the top left. Those are ladybird spiders. They're rather beautiful, aren't they? Particularly the male. The male is the red one. They're found in Europe. They are not common at all. But if we use morphological species concepts, would we naturally group these together as one species? Based upon what they look like, would you clump them? Probably not, right? But if we use biological, as in can they reproduce viable young, yes, we would say those are the same species. The top middle, the left one is a cactus. The right one is a euphorbs. Is anyone familiar with euphorbs? What's an example of a euphorbs? People start buying them, oh yeah.
they have thick, spongy leaf or stem, and they absorb water so they don't, they're like a cactus in that way that they don't need a lot of water because they hold water. Whereas the cactus, most of them are spiny, some of them are sharp, some of them are not.
So they have very similar phenotypes, right? They look a lot alike, probably for similar reasons, right? Things are not going to, they live in similar climates. They both live typically in climates that are, don't receive a lot of precipitation, so they both have like thick type of cuticles or very waxy cuticles. They both have spines. How the spines are genetically developed depends on if you're a euphorb or cactus. One is from the petiole, the other is from a different genetic pathway. The spines are probably, hypothetically, to prevent predation, right? Things don't like to eat things. Poke them. It's really annoying. A lot of these things have white, fluffy, you've seen some cactuses that are white and hairy, and the thought is that those hairs help reflect the sun, so it helps cool them down. Also, the hairs are annoying to eat as well. But there are some differences. So the euphorbs tend to have like a latex, a toxic substance, so you definitely wouldn't want to cut into a euphorb and eat it. Where the cactus tend to be more watery in substance. They develop in different areas, so we have cactuses. So we naturally have cactuses in the Americas. Euphorbs are Africa area. And there's something else I was going to say about this. But anyway, so if we look at morphology, we would group them. But if we look at biological or the phylogenetic species concept, we would probably put these separate. Oh, this is what I was going to say. Euphorbs, poinsettias. So right around now, poinsettias are out in the supermarkets and everywhere. Poinsettia is a type of euphorb. It's not native to this area. But they're beautiful. We bring them. Okay, the far right ones. Morphological species concept. We might be like, yeah, totally. Those are the same species. But what are they? What would you guys call them?
On the bottom one, they call it rat.
A rat. Okay, bottom one's a rat. What the heck? What is that top one? The hairless cat.
Are they both rodents?
Well, one's a cat and then the other one's a rat.
So only the bottom one is a rodent.
Oh.
The top one is a feline.
Yes.
The rodent's natural predator.
And I purposely put a picture of French bulldogs in here for many reasons. One reason is that Shanna, this is her dream dog. Mine too, dream dog. Okay, but I want to talk to you about these things. What are they? What species would you call them?
Adorable.
Canine. Canine. So what species concept are you using there?
I was using morphological because they're adorable.
Morphological. I agree with you. Morphologically, they look like other dogs, right? Other canines. Biologically, what do you guys know about French bulldogs? One of my good friends breeds these things. The reason, have you guys ever looked at the cost of the French bulldog? Do you know why they're so expensive?
I know that's why I don't have one.
Isn't there one kind of bulldog that, because of the size of its head, it has to be,
Yes, they cannot, first of all, get pregnant on their own. So you have to take them to the vet. The vet has to collect the semen from the male. And the vet has to take that semen and put it in the female when she's appropriately receptive. Then this poor female has to go in continuously because they have to make sure that she actually gets pregnant. Because if not, we have to try to inseminate again. And then if she is pregnant, she has to be monitored because she cannot naturally deliver those babies. Those heads are too big to come out of her canal, the birthing canal. So, French bulldogs exist. We know they exist. Shanna would like to own one someday. Are they a real true species? Would you call them a biological species? How would you group it? Man-made, artificial, right? We spend a lot of time and money and resources in creating these things, but should they exist? Probably not.
I just want to point out that she refers to French bulldogs as things, and she refers to the spiders as beautiful. Which just goes to show that just because people are friends, work together, and respect each other, does not mean they agree on everything.
However, I do like Dolly Parton, and they're fake like Dolly Parton, right? Yeah. She always advertised her plasticness. So, yeah. So, there has come into existence a U.S. Endangered Species Act. So before this act could be, there had to be some agreed upon definition of a species, right? If you're going to protect species, you have to define what is a species. And so they came up with what they call this operational species concept, which is a nice way that is calms down taxonomists, because different taxonomists have different species concepts, and you should say it's operational, it gets people to calm down a little bit. But
Basically what that means is we can't come to an agreement, so we're just going to say this is what works for now, let's move on.
yes.
Because as you've seen, how you categorize something wildly changes what family it belongs to or how you should think about that species. So this is the actual U.S. Endangered Species Act that is in place right now with this somewhat rudimentary definition that at least allows us to get some stuff done.
So I included, well, you guys can read the three purple bottom ones, but I included an image of, I think that these are silver salmon. I included them because I have several good friends and colleagues who work on salmon runs in Alaska. And you're able to, even though the species as a whole is not endangered, the particular run is endangered of certain streams and cat tributaries. And so there is research funding that is able to support the efforts needed to maintain certain runs. And so it has to do with, we're not defining species as a whole, but populations, or just even you can get even more minor than like a distinct population. Really tiny. Another thing to consider is how you lump species. So we have some idea of how you might define a species, but then you can lump species into broad groups. So if we look at one, for example, the sea otter. So we have sea otters. Sea otters are part of the weasel family. Sea otters eat crustaceans in general. They're non-specific crustacean eaters. One of the crustaceans that they like to eat are the sea urchins. And sea urchins, if there's a lot of sea urchins, they will consume sea kelp. Sea urchins eat sea kelp. And so if you have otters present, they keep the sea urchin number down, which permits these beautiful sea kelp forests. But if you remove otters from that, you wind up with a urchin overpopulation, which kills the sea kelp. Based upon that, I'm going to go back to this slide. Would you consider, just to find your connotation of these terms, I have to define them. Would you consider an otter to be indicating, umbrella, keystone, flagship, or dominant? Keystone. Okay, so I like keystone. You can actually define them under different areas. But yes, keystone is one excellent one. You guys familiar with keystones, where if you have like the old, it's not a lot of the Virgin Islands, but the old castles or old buildings, they build the walls of stone. The keystone's the middle one, where if you pull it down, everything else crumbles. It's like the stone that holds everything into place. And so if you were to remove otters from this, the whole environment would change. Otters are a keystone species. And as a side note, Kemp's ice cream, which is really cool, that I live in Rochester, and we have Kemp's right here. It's really neat. But one of the thickening agents in ice cream comes from sea kelp. And so we need to save the otters to save the sea kelp for the purpose of our ice cream.
How many of you are afraid she's going to tell you that there are sea otters in ice cream?
And as a side note, while speaking of random animals, how many of you guys like strawberry yogurt? How many of you guys keep strawberry Yoplait yogurt? Okay, so strawberry Yoplait yogurt, along with a lot of foods that contain red food colorings, that color dye, you see natural red or carmine colored, or I come up with, there's a whole bunch of names that they use, come from scale insects. So natural red, scale insects, you're just using that crushed up insect, which is also why some people have allergies to it, because there's a lot of other proteins in this natural red. Whereas just a food dye is a more single molecule. Okay, back to this. So keystone species.
Like, now that I've ruined your day, let's move on.
Yes. So jaguars. Jaguars are part of the panther family. So lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars. What's interesting about the panther family is that they all roar. Just want to let you know that. When I learned that, I thought that was pretty awesome. Jaguars live in environments where a lot of other organisms, I have one of these in my collection. Isn't it beautiful? A harlequin beetle? Love it. I caught it myself. Okay, back to it. So, they live in, and they require a vast amount of space. So one jaguar, if you were to save one jaguar, you would need to save a huge amount of space in order to have success. So what kind of species would you consider a jaguar?
Dominant?
No, we will get to dominant. Not dominant has, I can see where you're coming from
Here.
with that.
Here.
Umbrella.
Umbrella. The idea where if you save this one with such a wide space of territory, a specific territory, you save the jaguar, you protect everything else underneath that umbrella. So it would be considered an example of an umbrella species. Okay, I just added the northern leopard frog. So let's talk about frogs for a little bit. Frogs, tadpoles, live in water. We have a lot of compounds on the planet that we use that can dissolve in water. Their skin is porous, and the compounds that are dissolved in water can go straight into the frog. There is, and just as an example, an herbicide that was heavily used, is still heavily used in the Midwest, called atrazine. Atrazine is meant to kill plants. Right? Kill plants. Awesome. Atrazine works super, super well. Atrazine dissolves in water. And on an interesting note, atrazine mimics an enzyme that your body creates, aromatase. Does anyone know what aromatase does? Converts testosterone to estrogen. So it mimics aromatase. And what is happening is there are issues with frogs because they're becoming feminized. Their pouches have changed. Their gonads have changed. They are genetically male, but my word, very female in many characteristics because of this compound atrazine. Again, heavily used in the Midwest. You guys are drinking it. So, what would the northern leopard frog be? What kind of species? Indicator, yes, it indicates something about our environment. There was a researcher from Berkeley, I'm trying to blank on his name, who was doing a large road trip from the east all the way to the west. He was picking up frogs because that's what he works on, and he started noticing that the frogs are a little bit messed up in the Midwest. And he got some back, and like, what's up with these frogs? And then he was able to narrow it down to atrazine. And so yes, atrazine, not just frogs, snakes, and a lot of other organisms. They indicate quickly in the environment. Yep.
Wasn't atrazine banned years ago?
Not many
Because of the eagles?
I'm thinking DDT.
Okay.
DDT was definitely it. But it actually wasn't the DDT itself, it was probably the solvent that they were dissolving DDT in. That's probably causing that's different. Yes, that'll be a fun topic too. Okay, pandas. They're cute. What are they? Absolutely, flagship. People recognize them. People get warm and fuzzy feelings. Flagship species. Okay, dominant pertains to, for example, the mangroves. Any species that takes up a vast amount of space, and because of its presence, it is what makes up that biome. So because mangroves are present, you have certain fish species, you have different coral species, you have certain these really cool snails, you have all sorts of things that exist in that place because there are mangroves. If you were to pull them out, all those other organisms and relationships would disappear. So again, there has been, actually I want to go back to this. So we have these different kind of species or different clusters of species. Which one or ones do you think would be best for us to devote our money to save? What type of species?
Dominant and umbrella species.
Dominant and umbrella. Those are good. Why would you pick those?
Because the dominant one can house lots of different kinds of species, and then the umbrella one makes sure that the species that are living there are stay safe.
Right. You could also pick, absolutely, I like those. Some people would try to justify keystone species. Typically, umbrella and keystone and dominant would be the three that people could justify for spending a lot of our income and time and resources into saving. But which species do you think we actually are most interested in? Flagship, right? Cute, fuzzy, warm ones.
And understanding these differences is really important. You probably have heard news stories where we'll talk about construction being halted or having to get special permits because of a frog, and people will say, well, why is this important? Who cares about a frog? Well, as you've seen tonight, frogs are often indicator species. They let us know when something is amiss. And so saving indicator species can be really important because they are our canaries in coal mines. But if you don't have that background knowledge, that can be a hard thing to justify to the public. And then for flagship species are important in that they do draw in money, people want to save them, but ecologically speaking, they don't necessarily give the earth a lot. This lecture was actually first done between myself and a biologist who has moved on to another university, and it came because I listened to him rant for 20 minutes one day about how much he hated pandas. And I thought, how can you hate pandas? Pandas are so cute. But he hates pandas because we devote a lot of time and attention to saving them, when as a species, they don't seem to want to be saved. Pandas don't really mate on their own. They have to be convinced to mate. You have to show pandas panda pornography, essentially, in captivity to try to convince them to mate. They don't reproduce very well. They're exceedingly lazy, so they're super easy to catch. They eat bamboo, which has almost no caloric value, so that's why they just have to eat constantly and aren't very good at staving off other predators. Essentially speaking, as a species, if we believe in natural selection, we are artificially propping up the existence of pandas who are doing pretty much nothing to save themselves. And so I listened to this biologist just go on and on. And I was like, why are we trying so hard to save the pandas when we have all of these other species that are so much more important to save? And that was my first clue that there's a lot of stuff going on there. And how we make these decisions are things that we don't often agree on, but are super, super important for the future of the Earth.
Also about pandas, if they were to disappear, our planet would survive very just fine without them. We wouldn't miss them at all. And we have to rent our pandas. We pay about $1 million per panda. And if we breed a panda, and then we put a ton of effort with, as Shannon said, to get them to breed, we have to pay for that baby too. We're renting all the pandas.
Yep. China automatically owns all pandas. So any panda that you see in a zoo, even if U.S. scientists or zoologists have bred that panda still belongs to China, and we still pay rent for it.
And as a side note, that particular biologist Shannon's talking about, his wife is a zoo. So there's a lot of extra knowledge behind pandas with them.
He had a lot of feelings about this, is what I'm saying.
So yes, we have different groupings that we could agree upon that might be worthwhile to invest our time and energy to. And in 1973, actually under Nixon, he was president, they were able to enact an Endangered Species Act, which is wonderful. Prior to then, we didn't have legislation to purposely direct monies and support for the idea of saving endangered species. So what this does is this gives us a means. There's an actual program, a dedicated program with people, with money, with resources, and there are appropriate steps which are well publicized for people to get access to those monies. And there are different listing criteria. But the interesting part is there's a committee. So the Endangered Species Act is made up of a committee, and it's called the God Squad, because they get to decide who lives and who does.
Yeah, so the Endangered Species Act of 1973 says that if you're going to do anything that violates any of those top 5, you can't do it. But the God Squad, the Endangered Species Committee, is a committee that provides exemptions. So this committee, made up of, it's actually 7 people, take applications for exemptions. So for example, it may be a construction company wants to build an apartment high-rise next to a swamp where a northern leopard frog lives, an indicator species that is endangered. They would need to get an exemption from the God Squad and say, this is why we want to build a high-rise. We realize that it will endanger the lives of the northern leopard frog, but here's all of our reasons why we want to do that. And then the God Squad decides if that exemption will be granted. So I have, move forward. So this is the current Endangered Species Act Committee. It's made up of all of these members, and then since applications are given at a state level, when the God Squad meets, it'll also be with one representative of whichever state is in question. And that representative could be a governor, it could be a state senator, it could be a representative, it could be a scientist from the state. So it would usually be the governor's job to determine who that representative should be. So if, for example, we had a company that wanted an exemption in the state of Minnesota and filed an application with the Secretary of the Interior, which is the first step in the process, then Governor Dayton would determine a member from Minnesota to sit on the God Squad to help make this decision. So the process is that you file an application with the Secretary of Commerce or the Secretary of the Interior, and then you give them all the reasons why you believe you deserve this exemption for further endangering whatever species you're endangering, and then they vote on it. In order to pass the exemption, 5 of the 7 must agree. So this is the current God Squad, the members. These people are all appointed by the sitting president. So all of these people have been appointed by President Obama, and most of these positions are not up for review by any other body. Some are up for review by the Senate, but for the most part, the president decides. So it's always the Secretary of Agriculture, it's always the Secretary of the Army, and so forth, but who is appointed to fill those positions is decided upon by the president. So this is our current, quote-unquote, God Squad. This is going to change next year. We don't know who will be on the quote-unquote God Squad. There have been some names thrown about by the president-elect for some of these different positions. So we've heard a few names for the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. They include people like Don DeLocke, who is in charge of the Indiana Farm Bureau and is a close personal friend of Governor Mike Pence. Rick Perry, who is the former governor of Texas, or Sam Brownback, who is the current Kansas governor. We've also heard at least one name for the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Myron Ebel is the name most often cited for that position. He is currently on the president-elect's transition team, and he also happens to be someone who does not believe in climate change and is very vocal about that belief. For the Secretary of the Interior, the short list names, and these are all names that I found as of today, so this is pretty updated. We still don't know who's going to hold these positions, but Ray Washburn, who is a Dallas investor who has a lot of business ties to the gas and oil industry, or Forrest Lucas, who is the CEO in charge of Lucas Oil. These are the names of people so far that have been bandied about for some of these positions. I've also seen Sarah Palin as a potential for the Secretary of the Interior. The point is that who's on this God Squad matters quite a lot. If your God Squad is made up of people who are conservationally minded or very interested or very concerned about the environment, that means that relatively few exemptions will probably be granted. If your God Squad is made up of people who are maybe more business-minded or have fewer interests in environmental preservation, that means more exemptions are going to be granted, and that means more endangered species will be further threatened. So who is on this committee matters a lot, and there's pretty much no oversight in terms of how that decision is made. It's essentially just up to the president-elect. So this is just another example of how leaders make decisions that you maybe never even thought about, that have pretty far-reaching consequences, even globally, because the Endangered Species Act isn't just about actions that U.S. companies take within our borders. It's about actions that U.S. companies take anywhere in the world. So it doesn't just affect you and me and the species that live here. It affects the species that live everywhere. Who makes these decisions will matter quite a bit in terms of how those decisions get made.
Isn't there a possibility that some of the people that are going to be on this squad will be inclined to want to get rid of some of annoyances?
Potentially.
Like endangered species might be considered an annoyance.
It just depends on who's on there. I mean,
I remember Tennessee, when they were working on the Tennessee River, they had some small fish that they would have just as soon gotten rid of, but caused a big delay in the building of the Tennessee River.
yeah, I mean, there are certainly interests that have to be considered. So this is another thing where if this is something that you care about, your voice is important. So when these appointments are made, when the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture is determined, or when the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors is determined, those are often things that we don't pay very much attention to. Like, oh, that's some dry, dusty job that they do something that I don't care about, right? It's really complicated and I have no idea what they do. This is one thing that they do. This is one thing to know about. And to write representatives about, to call representatives about, if it is something that you don't agree with, or conversely, if you really like an appointment, letting those empowered know that is important as well. Did they make a good decision? Do you support it?
Okay, so kind of sticking with the idea, this is just looking at animals, so we are not including plants. And you can see that insects make up the largest known varieties of species. Again, putting a new species concept, typically most of these are kind of biological, but parts of fossils. But anyways, insects make up the most. And what I want to point out is that there is a sliver for mammals, but they actually had to like expand that sliver so you can see that there's a sliver. Mammals make up very little, very, very few. But when I Googled, I just today, I Googled endangered species. That's all I put into Google, endangered species. These things popped up. There are posters on endangered species, and all of them are like big, beautiful. A lot of them fall into the mammal area, right? We say that those are endangered species, yet the majority of endangered species are not attractive flagship species.
Animals that we would consider beautiful, not spiders, like Dr. Olson.
I like spiders. I have pet spiders. But here is some research. I like to point out this study. So it's talking about species inequality in scientific study. So what they're looking at is the number of publications and what species, and because of your species concept, but what species they were writing about. So the idea is that if there are publications happening for a species, that will give some indication that time, money, resources are being devoted towards that organism. And just to summarize, so what they specifically looked at, they even narrowed it down to a region, was Southern African species. And so at the top of the table, they lumped them. They have large animals, for which they defined what a large animal was. They had small mammals, and then birds, reptiles, amphibians. They did not even put insects, my favorite group on there, so it's nice, only insects. And if you look at just the table, large mammals, again, in South Africa, and excluding insects, and excluding plants, right? We're excluding a lot of things. So just these large mammals are 12%, and bird species make up 65% of the endangered species. And if you look at the figure 1, which is the bar graph here, what they're printing out on the y-axis is the mean number of records per species. And you can see that the large mammals, which is the far left one, so right there, large mammals, which again, 12% of the endangered species in South Africa account for the large majority of publications. And this indicates that there's again, time, resource, money, people, right? Efforts are being put into understanding large mammals. Whereas birds, which make up 65%, are right there, right? Significantly less than the large mammals.
Yeah, so when we say people don't care about species that are maybe more ecologically important, we're not saying this as like a us versus them, scientists know everything, and the populace are the ones at fault. No, no. Scientists, totally doing the same thing. We also have a focus that is perhaps not the right one.
So like my lab mate, his dream was to do ungulate research. He wanted to jump out of helicopters and land onto moose and take them. And he did that. He succeeded, right? There's actually money in this, and there's crazy people who want to jump out of helicopters and land on large ungulates and stick them. A lot of even entomologists, again, we don't even have insects on here, like to pick the pretty ones, right? Butterflies are the most biologically non-exciting insect group out there. But butterflies look pretty. Jewel beetles look gorgeous, right? You pick the pretty things to work on. Or, as a lot of people I know in taxonomy, I did a lot of taxonomy, they pick the ones with exciting travel. You want to go to the cloud forest, you pick an organism that lives in the cloud forest, right? You want to go spend time in Papua New Guinea, pick an organism that lives in Papua New Guinea. So you tend to pick and justify. You have to write grants, right? We have to write grants to support our research, to support our endeavors. And scientists write grants to justify their own interests.
Yeah. The point is scientists are people, just like anybody else, and are motivated by the same selfish or adventurous desires as anybody else. So there are relatively few scientists who are spending a lot of time studying things like insects or nematodes, or these species that are very ecologically important but aren't necessarily known or noticeable by the populace at large. We even have a biologist here who likes to say that the farther down the chain you go, the weirder the scientist gets that studies it. That the people who study elephants are super normal, and then the people who study nematodes are maybe the scientists that you avoid a little bit at conferences because they're odd. I like to think that as a sociologist, since I study people, that makes me the most normal.
That puts me in the box.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Think about that.
Okay, so back to the initial slide. And so if you were to select one or two, which organism would you select based upon the knowledge you now have?
Does anybody feel like they would change their answer? Yeah, we had some pretty informed people here who are like, hey, trees are important. Usually we give this, a form of this lecture to first-year students who are very invested in saving pandas and saving koala bears and saving bunny rabbits and things that are cute. And by the end, even if they don't, a lot of them will change their mind, a lot of them won't. They at least understand that how you make this decision matters a lot. And the criteria that you use will dramatically impact the outcome of what gets saved and what doesn't. Because we want to reiterate again, we are at a point where we don't get to save everything. Marine ecologists have already declared this past year, that it was the year that the Great Coral Reef, or the Great Barrier Reef, should be considered dead. It has been bleached so much that it is no longer a viable habitat for the many species that once lived there. We didn't save it. We didn't devote the resources to it. We didn't try to stop it. And so we didn't save it. This is a reality that many species are going to be facing. And we are the ones that have the power to influence what is going to happen. We decide. It's up to us what lives and what dies. So how are you going to make the decision?
I'd also like to point out that two species up there are technically not endangered. The sea otter is not on the endangered list. It has population swings and waxings, and some people in previous have purposely hunted them. And also the Spaven moss, but again, that's one that people like to harvest. If you go to craft stores, that's what they sell, and dried moss. Also, if you, like me, keep little critters in your house, you can buy the moss at pet stores, right? So it is under poaching, so to say, from people who want to sell it as a product.
I mean, it really is up to us. We are able to save some. The bald eagle, for example, I don't think it's either not endangered anymore or it's very close to not being endangered anymore. The gray wolf should probably not be considered endangered anymore in most places. We do have the capability to save species, and we have done so. But there are many others that have escaped our attention or do not ever draw our attention in the first place that are at risk. And unless we do something, their time on Earth is limited. Thank you. You have questions?
A few years ago, I was at a place